It's, portraits is one of those, again, enormous subjects, and we could be here hours looking at a comprehensive history of portraiture, and that history of portraiture could also become really boring because for a very long time in the history of Western art, it was only very rich people who could have their portrait taken. So the history of Western art is full of portraits of kings and queens and princes and princesses, and of course, politicians, kings. It's all the upper crust. And according to me, it gets boring. It gets boring very quickly, right? But what I've done is to cherry pick a few exciting examples, quite a few exciting examples that show different iterations and different ways in which people have portrayed themselves or portrayed other for specific reasons. So it's not quite an investigation by typology, but you'll see how it unfolds and how one example leads onto another. I still thought that it might be useful to retain some kind of chronological order in what I showed to you, so you can get a sense of how the preoccupation in portraiture changes across time as well. And I thought one interesting place to start could be Egypt, right? Because we find already a very important and valuable opportunity to ask ourselves, what is a portrait? What is the strange idea that we need to represent our faces? Why? Well, first of all, because we have a problem with one thing called death. You ever find yourselves thinking about death? We all get a little bit nervous, right, when we think about death. There is something about us, the existentialist idea. What are we doing on this planet? And if we are doing something memorable, we want our faces to outlive our bodies. We think that our faces will help people remember what we did. And there's a foundation to that. It's true, right? That's how we study history. The history book is filled with paintings and artifacts that show us what people may have looked like in the past. And of course, in a pre photographic world, sculpture and painting were the main media through which we captured the semblance of people who mattered. So the portrait in the history of art comes to life with this embedded meaning. If somebody has a portrait made of them, it means that they mattered. Very different from today, where unfortunately everyone has a phone in their hands and they do nothing with it but take selfies. So the idea that the portrait today has a value has changed dramatically. Anyone can take a selfie, anyone can take pictures of other people. There's so many faces around, but the idea that only the very rich or the very powerful could have their face captured is gone. Now, one of the most beautiful portraits, as you can see here, is incredibly detailed. The realism, the detail means that the face of the person being portrayed is not everyone else's. So the portrait also comes to life with a specific implication of identity. It's not just anyone. There are many paintings and sculptures in the history of art, I'll show you a few, of generic people. But the portrait is connected to identity because it is linked to memory. So you're not just remembering someone, you're remembering a specific individual. And so far as we can know, ideas related to the looks of Tutankhamun or other rulers in Egypt can only be assumed because of these funerary masks or sculptures that capture their semblance. As you can see, sculptures perpetuate somebody's appearance for eternity. Their faces have well decayed, what's left of them is dust, but portraits have made them immortal. Can you imagine your history book without images of this funerary mask, for instance? It would be so much harder for all of us to remember these powerful individuals. The image is what sticks. So you can understand why, throughout history, the rich and powerful have always pushed the idea of the portrait as essential, as not something you do if. If you can afford it, you do it. Now, there are many different approaches to the idea of there are many different approaches to the idea of the portrait. And of course, many of them are lost in history or histories that we're very vague about. For instance, this Nok sculpture, which was made by people in what today is called Nigeria, could be representing powerful leaders of tribes. And they all happen to be different. So without recurring to a Western classical realism, the sculptures are still trying to immortalize important people within a tribe. We find this approach shifting across the Mediterranean area. What is sculpture for? Sculpture is one of the most eclectic media. And in this case, throughout classical Greek sculpture, the Greeks sculpted gods that had generic faces. So this cannot be a portrait of Venus de Milo because Venus does not exist as a physical person. So the idea of the portrait also carries with it this notion that for it to count as a portrait, the person must have existed in a documented way. And of course, to the Greeks, it was so much more important to represent a sense of anatomical credibility that we know doesn't equate to accuracy, but that nonetheless captures an idea of purity and perfection that is superior to what reality can accomplish. Here's Polykleitos' golden ratio proportionality rule that shows us that your head should be contained in the height of your body 7 times. You might want to try this later on and see if it works. If you adapt to 7 times your head and your height, you will probably look more appealing and harmonious to other humans. This is the essence of the golden ratio that was discovered by the Greeks and applied throughout the classical period. Things, however, change, and they also change rapidly with Greek sculpture. As we know, sculpture has a power. Images have a power over the human mind. We already said that images are memorable and that they enable us to remember those who mattered a lot more than words. Well, the Romans became particularly aware of this power of the image, and they used imperial portraits like no other culture had done before. You probably also know that imperial sculptures were polychrome, so they were actually painted in full. So they looked a lot more realistic than the white marbles we see today. And that part of their role was to be disseminated across the Roman Empire. The portrait of the emperor told those who were enslaved and subjugated that this is now your ruler. And it was important that the emperor was captured with a semblance that was more or less faithful. And I say more or less faithful because, of course, we know that everyone wants to look better than we look. And what a better opportunity when you have a sculpture made of yourself to tell the artist, look, make my nose a little bit smaller, make me look a little bit more manly, give me a body of a Greek sculpture. Do you think old Roman emperors had bodies as we see here? No, of course not. The Greeks believed in the power of the mind being reflected in a healthy body. And that's what they are communicating through these types of representations. So if we had seen these emperors in the flesh, we would have probably noticed that they weren't quite as fit as they are in our minds today, thanks to, of course, history books using these images most often uncritically. History books never warned us about the pre-photoshopping of art. This other beautiful work of art is a bronze head of Ife. And again, it shows us the accuracy, the realism that African artists could accomplish with the use of bronze. Portraiture, again, of rulers especially, was widespread across the world. And the idea of using materials such as bronze or stone that are durable already reveals an understanding of the importance of history well before history becomes the discipline that we know today. After we're gone, it is a portrait that will enable people to narrate stories about us because we cannot narrate them anymore. So the idea of the portrait also comes to life with this embedded notion of narration, this embedded notion that you need a physical place marker to remind people that you did something worth telling others. And again, things become complicated. Like I said earlier, the idea of the portrait is connected to the notion of a person who truly existed, and it's documentable. And for as far as the Madonna and Jesus and Joseph can be documented, throughout the Middle Ages especially, we find a tendency not to make portraits of them, but to represent them in ways that are similar and yet different. The portrait also entails making somebody's image with them being present. So you copying a photograph of Marilyn Monroe is not quite a portrait. A portrait is done with the person in front of you. And unfortunately, there are no portraits of the Madonna and Jesus that were done in that context. During the Middle Ages, across Europe and the Middle East, and of course, further north, we find that artists use the same face all across the angels for the Madonna, mostly for Jesus that sometimes has his own face. And there's a kind of sense that ultimately their identity doesn't really matter. Also, most of the time, it doesn't match the Middle Eastern aesthetics that would have been more common at the time. So Jesus and the Madonna appear to be very pale, blue-eyed, very blonde at times. So portraits, they are not. Again, faces being used multiple times. The meaning of the work is spiritual, not necessarily a portrait. But things change when money becomes involved. Now, think about this. You're very, very wealthy, and you want everyone to know that you're powerful. So, what better way in the Renaissance than to tell your guests who came over for dinner that you have a new, exquisite painting made by the most incredible contemporary artist of the time, Piero della Francesca, which not only represents the Madonna and baby Jesus, as we see here, with a host of saints, very important. These are the celebrities, right, of the time. But it also includes you in the painting. Isn't that astonishing? Mind-blowing. Now, who is this man? This man here is the Duke of Montefeltro. And the Duke of Montefeltro is paying for this incredible painting by Piero della Francesca to be made. You can see the amount of work that went into the architectural structure to recreate the harmony of classical works of art. And he wants to be in the foreground because he's paying. Would you blame him? You're putting money into this, and you get backstage with the celebrities. This is one of the very early examples of a common mortal, of course, a very important and very wealthy common mortal, associating himself to sanctity in a painting, being close to the Madonna. So this change, the idea that wealthy individuals want to be represented in works of art to show how pious they are, because never forget, piety is an important value in Renaissance Italy that elevates you from all the other common mortals around you. And to express this piety by being close to the Madonna in the painting is a fabulous statement. So it is at this point in the Renaissance that it becomes also very important for artists to develop their skills in not just using generic faces like artists did in the Middle Ages, but to actually copy the semblance. As you can see here, the Duke of Montefeltro was very recognizable because of his nose that has a kind of eagle shape because of an accident he had during a battle. And you can see here his helmet here that also carries the damage that was caused by the blow that gave him this very distinctive nose. And he wants to be recognized, he wants to be seen. So at this point, artists can no longer just paint a face. As money becomes involved, also realism becomes essential. Imagine how disappointed you'd be if you asked a painter to make a beautiful portrait of yourself and then you look like your neighbor, right? That would be like, you wouldn't want that painting. So what is that for? I want me. I want my family to remember me for what I looked like. So there come all the wealthy across Europe. It becomes a fashion. And you can see here one of the most famous portrait paintings of the time by Jan van Eyck, one of the most talented artists of the Northern Renaissance, the Arnolfini portrait. On the left, you see Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife on the right. Giovanni Arnolfini was a fabric merchant, so he was extremely wealthy. And you can see here, you might remember from my previous talk on Still Life, that not everyone could wear fur. So you see him wearing fur, you know instantly he's wealthy. Also, his wife has a lot of fabric. Can you imagine walking around the house with this trail? Not very convenient, but when you're rich, you can do lots of very inconvenient things, and it seems like it doesn't matter. So, beautiful interior. You can see fabric everywhere, expensive furniture. The two of them, we assume, look like they did in real life, but to emphasize the power and the wealth of the Arnolfini, Jan van Eyck pulls an incredible stunt. the mirror that you see right behind them. This is, by the way, this painting is at the National Gallery in London. And that mirror that you see behind them is pretty much this big, like a 25 cents coin, like a quarter coin. And you can see, if I show you my enlargement, how detailed it is. You can see the Arnolfini couple from behind and the rest of the room from behind in it. Never forget, this is a time where artists are still struggling to get perspective right, and Van Eyck blows everyone out of the water. Also adding the stations of the cross right around it, just for good measure. I mean, incredible, absolutely incredible. And of course, the idea of the portrait is connected to the mirror. I'm going to show you some self-portraits as well today. But when you look at portraits, of course, they are almost like a magical mirror that preserves your semblance at the best of your beauty. Of course, who didn't miss the opportunity as portraits became more and more relevant across Renaissance Europe? Dürer, one of the most important artists of the Renaissance, is considered to be the Leonardo of the North, paints himself, as you can see, in a way that somehow made people think of Jesus. Is that a coincidence? Perhaps not. But you can see already how the portrait is becoming essential, a marketing tool in a sense. The portrait is not just for you to remember yourself or for your family members to remember you when you're gone. It's for others. The portrait tells them immediately, just by existing, that you're very wealthy, that you're important, and the way you pose for that portrait is essential. Look how Dürer seems to be caught in some deep thinking. You can see it in his eyes, you can see it in his seriousness, right? It's really important how you pose for a portrait. It says so much about your personality, so much about who you are. And then, I started to dwell a lot about whether I should put her in or not. Most famous painting in the world. Do we need to see her again? You're probably pleased to see her. So I put her in. But as you know, there's a lot of mystery still hovering around this portrait. And we can't really call it a portrait with confidence for that very reason. Is it a portrait of La Gioconda, the very wealthy wife of a banker who posed for Leonardo? Or is this a portrait, a self-portrait of Leonardo as a woman? We know that conspiracy theory has been going around for a very long while. Personally, as an art historian, I feel like not sure. There's really not much evidence that points in that direction. But of course, we know that Leonardo was obsessed with this portrait, that he worked on it for 15 years, right? And that he took it with him to the court of Fontainebleau, where he ultimately died. So it must have been special for a reason or another. Although I don't really know, if you work on something for so long, then it becomes something else. Maybe it started off being the portrait of La Gioconda, and then it turned into something different. Artists are strange people in very interesting ways. Back to the importance of power. Cranach painting Martin Luther. You will remember that Martin Luther ruined the party for the Roman Church, the beginning of Protestantism. This is one of the paintings you have seen in the history book all your life. We wouldn't know what he looked like without this painting. You can see it again in his eyes. That gaze, he's almost just slightly pleased with himself. I just wrecked the church. Not bad. Not bad as an accomplishment. Of course, as you notice, these characters can never smile too much or laugh or break the convention. There's a baseline for portraits that has to be maintained. They are a serious matter. You will be remembered for posterity, for eternity through them. And they have to convey a sense of gravitas. And on and off, there is a little wink, there's a little element that gives away that something else is happening in the mind of the sitter. And again, let me just remind you, in a pre-photographic world, painters and sculptors worked very differently from artists today who use photographs to create their work. So whenever you get a glint of um, some feeling, a glint of some kind of subtext on somebody's face, remember that the artist was able to convey that feeling, that subtlety, not by constantly gazing at a picture, but by creating that special moment out of their own memory and imagination. We talked about power and the power of portraits. And when it comes to embellishing yourself, I think Napoleon really knows a thing or two about it. Look how big he looks. You remember Napoleon was a short man, but in all his paintings he looks a lot taller. In this case, he's almost too big for the horse he rides. Some art historians have claimed that this is more of a metaphorical alteration than a mistake on the part of Jacques-Louis David. I remain unsure about it, but there is something interesting about this notion that in this portrait, the equestrian portrait especially, carries this power that is not just grounded in the face and the body of the protagonist, but the horse plays an important role. The horse elevates the main character from the ground, from the toiling of everyday life, and it becomes monumentalized, right? You can see how this figure is just emerging from the landscape, elevated by the horse, and the qualities of the horse are transferred to Napoleon. The strength, the power, the determination of the horse. He becomes a mythical creature. It's like, one of those incredible chimeras rather than a common mortal. But to make things more interesting, we got to remember that Napoleon didn't cross the Alps on a horse. He was actually on a donkey. This less glorious portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps was made in 1850, 50 years after the event, by Delaroche, who was a realist artist who wanted to set the record straight and really kind of ridiculed Napoleon in a sense by telling the truth. There's no way a horse can ride its way up the Alps, but a donkey can. What was the problem with a donkey? A donkey is not really a regal animal. You know how horses have a regal lineage. They have been selectively bred across time, like the royals, in order to retain a purity. And donkeys are a totally different deal. They work very hard, they're a little stubborn, and they're not to royals particularly pretty. But there they are doing the work. So this is an anti-royal portrait. Love this painting. We actually needed more artists as brave as Delaroche to just tell things the way they were. And maybe we would know our history better, right? We would really understand that we've been lied to for so long in so many ways. Now, another fantastic portrait here of a female protagonist of the 18th century painting, Adelaide Lebel-Guiard. You can see here this beautiful self-portrait with two pupils, Marie-Gabrielle Capet and Marie-Marguerite Corot de Rosemonde. You can see something unusual here, perhaps, when it comes to the studio. I don't know if you paint, and maybe perhaps when you paint, you put on your best evening gown just because you feel like elevated by it. I don't. Painting is messy. Adelaide is probably using oil color that requires some turpentine to be diluted. You don't want to wear a dress like that. It's going to be trashed. So the question is, why is she wearing this in the painting? Well, let's say that first of all, there was a fashion at the time. Even male painters painted themselves, at their best. There was this idea that the portrait is your best shot. In this case, selfies as well as portraits of today that we take with our phones are more or less the same. You want to capture yourself looking your best. But in this case, you can really see the absurdity, perhaps in the hat. It's just like, really, she's ready for the ball. But there's also this idea of gender and gender expectations woven into this painting. The idea that much more than men, women had to be perfect and the most beautiful all the time. So here is that pressure that makes her paint herself in this way. And you can see here the gaze of man, right, in the form of a sculpture looking over, right? So there's something very interesting about this painting that goes well beyond the idea of just capturing your semblance for posterity. And then again, artists, artists, artists. Are artists self-obsessed? Are artists narcissists? Many of them are. There's no argument about it. And that's why we also have so many self-portraits. I mean, you can probably argue that artists have it easy, in a sense, and the temptation is around the corner to make a self-portrait because they can do it. And they don't have to pay anybody. So why not? Some artists, like Degas, this is a very young Degas, as you can see here again, paints himself as a very serious thinker, as a very serious young man. This is an opportunity for you to tell others who you are and how you like others to see you. Others waste no time at painting their faces over and over and over. Now, Van Gogh painted himself more than 30 times, and he only painted 10 years, between 1880 and 1890. Work it out, it adds up to more than 3 self-portraits per year. We know that he spent his days painting, right? But there was clearly an interest there to self-mythologize, right? That's also what self-portraits are about. You are telling everybody who you are, the way you want to be seen. And it works, because today we wouldn't know what Van Gogh looks like if it wasn't for these self-portraits, and that's why he's so famous. Well, there's many reasons why he's so famous. You probably remember his sister-in-law was a genius, a marketing genius, and that's, it's all down to her. But the idea that she could also use the self-portrait to substantiate the narrative, that the letters also that he sent to Theo and other people weave around. I mean, like, Van Gogh is not just a great artist. I mean, I cannot say that he wasn't talented. He was extremely talented, but without the mythology that the self-portraits, the letters, and the stories all around him have created over time, he wouldn't be the marketing gold mine that he is today. I'm sure some of you have gone to that monstrosity called the Van Gogh immersive experience, right? Anyway, not the subject of this lecture, but to have that kind of marketing gravitas, to have an immersive experience of your work, you need to be a certain kind of artist that has lots of self-portraits that have turned you into a star, right? And that's where you get, of course, another artist that I'm sure you're thinking about right now who will come up in the lecture. But Van Gogh, unlike others who painted themselves always at the best, also gave us haunting self-portraits. The one after the slashing of the ear. You will remember that the slashing of the ear is one of the most... Let's talk about drama, marketing, and selling something. I mean, these are the stories that sell. You will remember that he shared the Yellow House for a little bit of time, a few months, with Gauguin, and that wasn't a good idea. The two argued all the time, and Gauguin liked to apparently torture Van Gogh a little. Van Gogh was in love with this prostitute called Rachel in the local brothel, and he made a fatal mistake. You never tell your guests when they visit where the brothel is, do you? No, you don't. It's not a good idea, especially if you have fallen in love with one of the prostitutes. Of course, Gauguin wasted no opportunity to tease Van Gogh and claim that he too was in love with Rachel and that Rachel was reciprocating. The two had a terrible argument, and as you do, Van Gogh brandished a razor and started to chase Gauguin around the streets of Arles. There was a lot of screaming, there was a lot of yelling. Then Gauguin luckily found a dark alley where he could hide. Poor Van Gogh, caught into his rage, into this moment of uncontrollable rage, chopped off his ear, as you do, and wrapped it up in a piece of cloth. He then took it to Rachel as a gift. I'm not quite sure why. Rachel didn't like the gift. She called the police instead. And unfortunately, that also spelled the end of Van Gogh and the Yellow House. It's really interesting, I think. This is a little bit against the grain in the tradition of self portraits to paint yourself with bandages and to paint yourself in a way that invites empathy because of vulnerability rather than inviting awe because of the power and beauty that you seem to embody. And as you know, Van Gogh also used objects and rooms in order to represent himself. I always like to think about the bedroom, this is the bedroom that we have at the Art Institute of Chicago, as a self portrait of the artist without the artist in it. Think about it. A bedroom is a very personal, very intimate space. And Van Gogh paints it with this honesty about his poverty. You can see that everything is very bare. He places his signature very tellingly. Um, Sorry, I heard something. No? Okay. So he creates this beautiful environment. He basically tells us this is how humble my life is, how basic it is. And you can see the two chairs that we encounter in this room might be suggesting a sense of loneliness, wanting to share space with somebody else, which, as we know, happens, it's Gauguin, and it becomes a very bad idea. The window has been interpreted as a sign of his inability to relate with others in the outside world. And here on the top right, you can see a self portrait of the artist. This is actually one of his self portraits that he paints in the bedroom itself. So you can really get a sense of how this bedroom is not just a bedroom, it's not just any room. And of course, this is a wonderful self-portrait he made in which he uses a more pointillist style. And there's a lot has been written about Van Gogh's portraits, self-portraits, and what he tries to convey with them. In some of them, he looks victorious and accomplished and in charge of his personality and who he is, and in others, his gaze suggests this loneliness, this sorrow, this tiredness. When you look at them all together, you can really see how his ability to convey his emotion through the self-portraits is really noticeable. And that also is what tells us that he is a great artist beyond the right elements, the elements of success being lined up properly in his career to become what he became after his death, of course. Gauguin, do you remember good Gauguin? Good old Gauguin. Well, he had an interesting take, Gauguin, on the self-portrait. While Van Gogh painted himself as himself, Gauguin kind of thought that painting himself as himself wasn't quite enough. So more than once, he painted himself as Jesus. Have you ever tried that one? Is it a little bit megalomaniac? Like, I'm painting myself as Jesus. Here's Gauguin using his face for a painting of Christ in the garden. What is Gauguin trying to tell us? Well, he thought this one is perhaps not enough. So I want to reiterate the message. I am Christ on the cross. What do you think about this one? Now, why is Gauguin crucifying himself and painting himself as a suffering Jesus? Because Gauguin knew one thing. He knew that he was the best painter in the world. So he said in more than one of his letters. Again, little narcissist, maybe. Of course, when you're the best painter in the world, in your humble opinion, and the world doesn't agree with you, then you carry a cross, don't you? Yes, you do. And that's exactly what Gauguin is trying to convey with this painting, that the world does not understand his greatness. He is a victim, right, of this inability. Like, you will remember, Jesus was not believed, and that led to the crucifixion. So you see these analogies running through. Very interesting, right, what artists can do when it comes to self-portraits. Now let's move away briefly from self-portraits to a portrait that caused an enormous scandal in Paris when it was first unveiled. You will remember Sargent made a fortune becoming a high-class society portraitist. The celebrities and wealthies of the time lined up outside his studio to be painted. He was so fashionable. And Madame Pierre Gautreau unfortunately became the one socialite who has been described as the Kim Kardashian of her time to actually have her portrait backfire. We look at it today, we see nothing wrong with it, apart from this plunging neckline. You can really see that it's a little risque, perhaps, for the time, but it wasn't just that detail that turned out to be problematic. This is not the original version of the painting. We have photographs of the original painting before it was altered. And you can see here that the shoulder strap was not pulled up, but it was leaning off the shoulder. And that was considered to be a terrible sign of lasciviousness. That was terrible, terrible thing for a lady to express in a painting at this time. When it was exhibited in public, the mother of Madame Gautreau was absolutely appalled, and she threatened the artist. That's why he had to change the painting back, and still it was considered to be over the top in terms of what was acceptable for the time. Now, this portrait actually caused the artist to relocate to the United Kingdom because the scandal was so intense in France that for a short while nobody wanted to have their portrait taken by him. They didn't trust him anymore that he would paint them in ways that could not destroy their social reputation. So he moved to the United Kingdom, where he had to start his career pretty much from scratch, which is quite unbelievable. But the French used to get upset about lots of things at this time. And we talked about portraits and how important it is that portraits look like you and not just somebody. Well, that didn't apply to Cubism. As you can see here, Ambrose Vollard was painted by Picasso in a way that's extremely loyal to the Cubist style, so seen from different angles, facets brought together. You can't almost tell who this person is, right? Would you be happy with a Cubist painting by Picasso made of yourselves? Nice portrait? Maybe not. Or maybe yes. Who says that a portrait must look like you after the invention of photography? Photography was invented in 1826. By 1839, it is launched in Paris to great acclaim, and it is this man, Louis Daguerre, who invents the type of photography that could be commercialized in 1839. There were other inventors prior to him, like Niepce for Niepce, who had already invented photography that wasn't quite as good quality-wise, and it was his assistant who perfected it. You can see how Daguerre poses proudly in his daguerreotype that made him a millionaire for the time. Once photography is invented, people begin to use it to promote themselves. This is Sarah Bernhardt, who was a very successful actress at the time, and she realized one thing, that photography could be used as a weapon to make yourself more famous. So she posed for this beautiful portrait of herself, inspired by a play that she was in at the time. And then she proceeded to send somebody on a hot air balloon and throw these pictures all across Paris. You can imagine how fantastic. This is marketing at its best for the 19th century. How amazing it must have been for people to see photographs coming down from the sky of somebody who was already famous and that they could take home as a keepsake. People didn't have lots of photographs and images around them in their lives. So this was an incredible publicity stunt that really bolstered Sarah Bernhardt's fame. But when it comes to fame and understanding the purpose and the role photography can play in make you famous, nobody, and I say nobody, can be compared to the one and only Contessa di Castiglione. If you've never heard her name and you're wondering who is this lady, you've got some research to do this weekend. Look her up online. I'm going to also show you the film that was made about her. She's a photography pioneer who, because of course she is a woman, was sidelined in the history of art and history of photography books only until recently. But what did she do to carve her place in the history of photography book? Well, she worked in collaboration with Pierre Louis Pierson and staged portraits of herself, sometimes as herself, and at other times as mythological or fictional characters, some of which she invented, some of which came from philosophy books, mythology, history. She was extremely rich. She was a socialite in Italy who was then sent to France by the Italian government to seduce Napoleon III for diplomatic reasons. She became extremely famous in France. She was considered to be the most beautiful woman in the world and became well known for her entrances at parties, which was apparently spectacular and unforgettable. All women at the time were absolutely jealous of her. And of course, she developed a bit of a reputation for being a little loose. But, these things come with fame. So, people being jealous and, kind of bad-mouthing you all the time. But what's interesting about the Countess of Castiglione, here's the film you can look up online, try to see if it's available with subtitles in English. You can just look at the pretty pictures and learn Italian in the process. She posed for these pictures, spending a fortune, thinking about more than 400 photographs of her posing, as you can see, in incredible clothes that she had tailor-made for her, for the photographs or for parties in France. You can see that she poses. It's theatrical. It's not just here I am. Using mirrors, as you can see here, as well as being creative with the cropping of her photographs. You can see here how confident she is with the camera, almost flirty at times, and oftentimes showing off incredible hairstyles that were super expensive to have done. Look at the scenery as well. She's also been known for choosing the backdrops and buying furniture especially As you can see here in this specific shot, she is illustrating the beauty and complexity of a dress that she wore at a party. Look at the hair. I mean, seriously, talk about pioneers. And from the most photographed woman of the 19th century in Europe to the most photographed man in the United States. Frederick Douglass was pretty much, let's say, the equivalent of the Countess of Castiglione, not in the way he used photography, because the Countess of Castiglione was crafting characters and crafting herself as a character, while Frederick Douglass was interested in dignifying black individuals through the camera. He used photography to give himself the social credibility that will write him in history as one of the key protagonists in the history of social rights. And again, throughout the history of the portrait, you can see this awareness that in order for your name to be remembered, you need to attach an image to it. But with photography, the game is different. And sometimes, as you can see in this portrait, individuals pose as if they posed for a painting. Look at the gaze. It's penetrating, it's looking at you with this slightly confrontational challenge and yet confidence. The smile, how you orchestrate your smile, the seriousness. These are the images that ultimately built his credibility. Think about a world without TV in which you're reading articles about this man. The image is essential, and the image sets the tone for what you will read. So extremely important for this time. And of course, like I said earlier, rich people knew exactly what portraits could do all along. Madame Motissier, this is by the way a painting, I'm showing you this because these paintings, as you can see, this was made at a time in which photography existed. So even when photography came in, artists continued to get commissions for portraits because a photograph of a portrait is not the same as a power statement, as a big painting in your home. And if you're very rich at this time, you still want a big painting in your home. Madame Motissier was the wife of a very wealthy banker, and she insisted that Ingres, one of the most famous artists in France at the time, had to make her portrait. Nobody else. Ingres didn't want to paint her because he wanted to focus on history and mythology subjects. He felt that doing a portrait of her would have sort of cheapened him. So her husband had to pay so much money to convince him. And it took him 15 years to make this painting. You can imagine that Madame Motissier must have changed a great deal in 15 years, and yet she looks fresh and perfect, like a porcelain doll. Look at her skin, right? These are things that photography cannot capture quite as well, with the sense of preciousness. Also, look at the details. She has a Chinese fan, a Chinese vase, and this dress in itself, the fabric, the jewelry, everything screams money, 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 power. And those who try to accomplish the same with photography unfortunately didn't quite reach the standard, because photography couldn't take away at the time the bags under your eyes. Your jewelry doesn't look quite as expensive, possibly because also it isn't, and so your dress. So you can see how people flocked to photographers in order to have portraits taken, but the result is, by comparison, a little underwhelming. One of the things about, in this case, this lady has been shrunk so much, into a bustier, and then probably altered a little bit, that her head looks massive. The one thing about the portraits of the daguerreotypes that is very interesting is that the daguerreotypes were portable. So you can see these little frames, right? These metal frames. And the daguerreotypes are usually this big, so you can put it in your pocket and then pull it out and take a look at your loved ones at a time in which it was not possible to see your loved ones if you traveled away from them. And of course, you wouldn't carry a painting with you either, right? So portable pocket pictures, a little bit like your phones today, became all the rage across Europe. And a family portrait. Have you ever commissioned a family portrait? Do you know how expensive it is to have a good artist taking not just one of you, five? So photography comes in and family portraits become all the rage. Of course, one of the challenges is to have five faces in focus all the time because people move, blink, right? And exposure times at this point in history are longer than today. And if a flat photographic portrait is not enough, you could commission a stereoscopic portrait of yourself. You look at these two pictures through these visors and you see a three-dimensional, almost holographic apparition of your loved one. This is actually foldable into a case. So it looks like a daguerreotype, a normal daguerreotype. You open it up, the visor faces the double photographs. And wherever you are in the world, you can gaze at your loved one appearing three-dimensionally in front of you. So of course the photographic revolution changes everything, but artists continue to paint themselves, especially in ways that photography at the time, even in the 1940s, couldn't quite accomplish as well as painting does. As you will remember, Frida Kahlo was a surrealist artist who used extensively painting and self-portrait in order to express her interior pain, a pain caused partly by a terrible accident that she incurred when traveling on a bus and required extensive medical care, but also pain that was inflicted by her husband, Diego Rivera, who constantly cheated on her. This is perhaps one of the most iconic paintings by Frida, in which she tries to reconcile her Mexican self bound to tradition and that Mexican feminine identity, the role of femininity that she's expected to perform, with a Frida Kahlo that she understands as being more modern and less compliant with tradition. We can see here again the struggle between tradition and modernity in a 1935 self-portrait with cropped hair, which at the time was seen as a very radical slap in the face to Mexican traditions. And talk about women breaking rules in the context of surrealism. Wanda Waltz made a photo montage of her and her cat. Now, this is often misunderstood to represent that kind of feline quality that is associated with women, the idea of mystery, the idea of the impossibility to own women. But actually what Wanda Waltz is exploring here is the proximity with her cat, Pippo. So she had this pet that she spent a lot of time with. And you know that idea that you become a little bit like your cat, right? Or your dog when you spend time with them. So this picture is exploring this notion of the portrait of two entities, her and the cat, that have come together in time. Surrealism also opened the doors for the portrait to become a much more complex opportunity for exploring identity. You might remember Jewish transgender artist Claude Kohn, who explored non-binary gender representation by looking androgynous in photographs that were taken by them, and sometimes setting up situations like you see in this self-portrait that is very humorous. I am in training, don't kiss me, reads Kohn's top. And you can notice here this dumbbell as well. Again, blending male and female, and at the same time playing with norms and expectations bound to gender. You can see here as well one of the artist's photo montages that plays with this notion of androgyny and gender. And of course, we've been talking about portraits that are mostly intentional and premeditated. We've been talking about portraits that are commissioned, where a wealthy individual says, I want to be remembered like this, paint me like that. But what happens when you walk on the streets and a photographer says, hey, can I take a photograph of you? They don't know you don't know them. You might say yes and pose for them without any kind of control or very little control about the final result. Well, Diane Arbus was the artist when it came to this approach, and she gave us some of the most iconic and beautiful portraits of strangers. You can see here identical twins caught in Roselle, New Jersey. At that point, something very interesting happens. There's a notion about portrait. If you're an artist and you are commissioned a portrait, you will spend time with the sitter, extensive time, because they come back to you to pose in front of you. At that time, you will get to know them. You will talk to them and understand parts of their personality. It is widespread knowledge, and perhaps you can argue maybe perhaps a little bit of a myth, that artists are able to convey something of the personality of the sitter that they acquire, that knowledge that they acquire through the sittings into the painting. Photography, however, when it comes to capturing something, can be a lot more disengaged and immediate. That doesn't necessarily mean that photography captures less, but it might mean that photography captures something else that painting cannot capture. And that's what emerges, I think, in the work of Diane Arbus. This idea of the spontaneity, this idea of the I'm not ready for you, I'm not putting up a show, or I'm not at my best or the most beautiful, but I'm here now, and photography can capture that here now in a way that nothing else can. This is certainly the case with Malian photographer Malik Sidibé, who made beautiful portraits of his community in Mali. These portraits are much more powerful and indicative of what we have seen up until now, in the sense that they are politically rebellious. So back in the days, during the 70s in Mali, it was forbidden to wear Western clothes and to listen to Western music. And of course, like it is when legal imposition are placed onto something, a subversive underground world begins to bubble up. And in this case, Malik Sidibé photographed and documented parties with people in his community who wore Western clothing and listened to mostly American music. You can see them here dancing, and again, wearing clothes that to them represented freedom, even when perhaps in the West, a suit already didn't represent freedom. You can see them here proudly posing with the albums that made their lives subversive. And these kind of pictures were dangerous because should they have fallen into the hands of authorities, these people could have been arrested. But you see the pride here in showing your face, being immortalized as part of this moment, as part of this community that wants to reach beyond the restriction of totalitarian regimes. And sometimes self-portraits can be the opposite. Remember, we looked at the Contessa di Castiglione and how she crafted characters. Well, if there's one artist who has used the Countess of Castiglione as a muse, is certainly Cindy Sherman, with her very famous series of film stills. As you will remember, Cindy Sherman poses in every picture. This is the artist herself, but these are not self-portraits in the classical sense. She's here posing as a mysterious woman, a fragment of a narrative she never delivers, and that we are invited to create and explore, make up and live with her. In this case, Cindy Sherman is altering our expectations and asking us to think more carefully and more critically about our assumption when we look at a portrait. How old is this woman? What is her social extraction? Where does she come from? How wealthy is she? Where is she going? Is she upset? All these questions become the foundations of a narrative that is personal and that we devise. And we realize that this is what happens when we look at strangers. It's a little bit like people watching. This is one of the many portraits that was taken by Philip Lorca di Corsia, one of the most famous contemporary artists. He would set up a scaffold and flashlights in Times Square in New York. And there, without a warning, at a certain time, he would just let the flash go off, and the camera nearby, that was still invisible and not very conspicuous to the passers-by, would capture a beautiful photograph of them. Of course, they have no knowledge that this might be happening, but the photograph is then exhibited and included in a book. Would you be upset that a photograph of you has been taken without your permission and that it's then part of an exhibition and part of a book? Some people were not. This specific individual was really upset because, as a radical Jewish person, it was against his religion to have his photograph taken. And he took the artist to court. But unfortunately, because of the law in New York City that allows the photography of strangers to happen, he lost. And his photographs is still part of the series that was made by Lorca di Corsia. You can see how these portraits are very different from anything or most anything we've seen today, because the person that's photographed most often is not even looking at the camera. So there's a sense of voyeurism here. And then we have to question ourselves, what are the boundaries of privacy? And how long and how hard am I allowed to look at a stranger? And then the question really becomes, why am I looking? What do I want to see? Well, Nan Goldin was very aware of the power of photography. And in 1984, she took the kind of self-portrait that nobody wants to take in order to raise awareness of domestic violence. Do you remember 1984? Believe it or not, with my other classes at SAIC, I can't even tell them that they were born in 2001 at this point. So 1984 is not on their map at all. But in 1984, domestic violence wasn't a term that you came across often. And it was happening, of course, a great deal. So Nan Goldin, unfortunately, was in an abusive relationship. And she took this self-portrait as a reminder for herself and for others never to let this happen to you. Sometimes we need a photograph of ourselves at our lowest to remind ourselves not to let something happen again. This has become a quintessential staple in the art history book. Nan Goldin is one of the most famous photographers in the history of art. And what's frightening about this photograph is how she used the title to emphasize the seriousness of her injury. Look at the title. It's Nan 1 month after being battered. Can you imagine what she must have looked like right after this assault? And it's also a photograph that has caused a lot of controversy because of her use of makeup and jewelry. Some feminist scholars think that the lipstick and the jewelry feminizes her in a way that contradicts her intention. That ultimately the lipstick and the jewelry is what led her to be violated. But other historians claim that the opposite is true, that Nan Goldin is putting on lipstick and jewelry and has her hair done up to remind herself that she can rebuild herself as a woman and carry on. And of course, you can be the judges of what this photograph is trying to mean and what it does. Now, it might look to you as if this painting is out of sequence because it's from 1812, but it is not, because we're going to look at Kehinde Wiley, who uses the tradition of classical art in order to elevate the individuals of the Black community who are passers-by. So you will remember that we looked at a very similar portrait of Napoleon on a horse, and the notion that you could only have a portrait like that made of yourself if you're very famous and powerful runs across the history of Western art. So Kehinde Wiley thought, why not paint Black people, since there is a complete, almost complete absence of Black people in the history of Western art, not as slave, as sometimes they are represented, but as confident and powerful individuals in their own right. So for a long while, his practice has relied upon seeing people on the street that he thinks are interesting, and then taking them back to the studio to ask them, what do you want to be painted like? It has to be a style from the Renaissance or from classical art that elevates you, and he negotiates the representation of the individual with them to come up with something that they are proud of themselves. And you can see that the paintings take on this extremely celebratory aesthetic, where plants and flowers also often are the result of conversations had with the sitter. I showed you something beautiful, I have to balance it with something a little bit more haunting and mysterious. Francis Bacon, a painting that some of you may have seen at the Art Institute of Chicago. This is on the 3rd floor of the Modern Wing, and it's one of the most haunting paintings in the history of recent modern art. It's one of my favorite paintings. Francis Bacon is very well known in Britain, and he's not perhaps quite an household name here in the United States, but this work is extremely telling. It's not just a portrait of Innocent X, it's a rework. And it's a rework based on an anecdote. Apparently, when Pope Innocent X saw this portrait made by Velázquez, when the painting was finished, the Pope said to Velázquez, "I don't like this. You made me look a little too real." He wanted to look a little bit more timeless, a little bit more empowered and prominent. So Francis Bacon revisits that notion and thought, well, too real. What is too real? To Francis Bacon, what is real is the internal suffering that we cannot express through our words. You can see that the Pope screams. He screams with the pressure of the pain that he carries within him. The animal pressure, which is exemplified by the open carcass right behind him, and that it's primal, primordial. Think about the scream. The scream is the moment in which language fails you. What you are experiencing is so overwhelming that you can't utter words. And in this case, Francis Bacon accomplishes the impossible. He paints a portrait of a historical figure in a way that it completely undermines their power on earth, which is the highest, the Pope representing God on earth. Another controversial portrait, some of you may be aware of, a sculpture by artist Mark Quinn of Alison Lapper. Alison Lapper is a British individual with no particular fame attached to her, apart from this sculpture for which she was selected by Mark Quinn. This sculpture was exhibited in Trafalgar Square for 4 months, as part of an ongoing art project in which, in a rotation, a contemporary artist is given the opportunity to occupy one of the empty plinths in Trafalgar Square. This caused a major controversy because it revealed the hypocrisy of people. As you know, classical sculpture celebrates perfection and beauty, and to use white classical marble in such controversial way to exhibit what in society has been for such a long time considered to be far from beauty upset people. But what is more beautiful than to think of a person who, against all adversities, can still thrive and be independent? Now, one of the things that might not be obvious here in the picture, but the title reveal, is that the subject, Alison Lapper, is actually pregnant. So you can see how Mark Quinn really pushes so many buttons. Our ethics, our expectations, our stereotypes, our prejudice. And it worked. Those of you who might remember the Olympics, I think it was 2012, if I remember correctly, when they took place in London. As part of the opening parade, a massive recreation of the sculptures was ushered and paraded at the very beginning, which tells you also how culturally important that sculpture has become in the United Kingdom. And talk about politics. Ai Weiwei, what about taking a self-portrait of yourself smashing a very rare, well, not so rare, but very precious old Han Dynasty urn? How to disrespect your country, how to challenge authoritarian power, but also how to, with a very simple gesture, question our relationship with the past and what we have been told to think about the past. I'm sure many of you are thinking, I still would rather make that point without destroying a historic artifact, and I can agree with you. But there is something really fascinating about the power of the portrait in this sequence, right? And in the meaning that it wants to capture. Not another out of sync slide, but the baseline for the last artist I want to show you today, Lucian Freud. You will remember how the Venus is the quintessential idea of perfection, and no artist like Lucian Freud has reinvented the idea of the portrait and the nude based on the subversion of classical beauty. Lucian Freud, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, is enormously famous in Europe, not so much in the US, and he is considered to be the reinventor of the nude for the modern age. Now, as you can see, he celebrates a different kind of beauty, a beauty that is much more idiosyncratic and realistic. But a very interesting idea about the beauty he represents in his portraits is the notion of negotiating the pose with the sitter. He used to take, because he died in 2011, of course, he used to take an inordinate amount of time to represent his sitters. Sometimes 100 sittings. The paintings would take over a year to be completed. And he would therefore negotiate the pose, asking the sitter, how do you want to pose for me? Because you're going to hold this pose for many, many, many months, almost every day. And also, I want you to express something about you that is not necessarily your social status or your identity as a personality. So through your body, you are suggesting something that is related to your vulnerability as a human being. There is something very vulnerable, very real, very dislocated from the social power. Think about all the portraits we have seen as political agitator, as emperor, as memorable artist. This is Lee Bowery, who was a famous artist in his own right. But as you can see here, the portrait turns him into a naked body in which nothing he's accomplished in life really matters. Lucian Freud was always trying to get to a sense of reality, to a sense of what's underneath the surface. This is a friend of his, Harry Diamond, who became a pretty successful photographer in the United Kingdom, but who had a very rough and tumble upbringing and couldn't speak much. His way of expressing himself was mostly through photographs. So in this beautiful painting that it's life-size, Lucian Freud switches the plant and the subject, casting a very strange encounter between two entities that don't speak very much, don't communicate much. And you can see here how Harry Diamond seems puzzled at the encounter with a plant in his apartment. Did it move when I was out? Look at the carpet. You can see how he stares at the plant as if he wants to know something from it, and the carpet looks unsettled. Did somebody move it in my absence? Everything is mysterious, and yet this portrait captures so much about this artist. Even in the blemishes and the suffering of the plant, the broken pot, things are not perfect. Things are not frozen in time in the purity of classical art. So portraits can actually also capture imperfections. They can capture inadequacies. They can capture awkward, strange moments in life, not just about us, but our relationships with others. And when it comes to awkward, Lucian Freud really beat any other artist with this self-portrait from 1968 called Interior with Plant, Reflection, Listening. I don't know if you remember, but towards the end of the 60s, early 70s, there was a bit of a fad about talking with plants. And Lucian Freud is kind of tapping into that with this painting. You can see him here in the background trying to listen. And I don't know if you talk to your plants and if they ever respond to you. But there's something really fascinating about this idea that your house plant, because it stays around you so much, can absorb some of your happiness, your joy, your sadness. And even if it cannot speak, it knows something about you. So in a sense, this might be a self-portrait of the artist, but this is a portrait of a houseplant he's had for a very long time. You can see that once again, the leaves are blemished. Some of them are dry. This is not the kind of plant you buy at the gardening store or a kind of plant that you can replace easily. So think about the idea of making a portrait of a plant, that it's not just a botanical illustration or representation, but it's the portrait of a specific plant. Groundbreaking. And there's Lucian trying to listen to what the plant might be saying. And on that proposition, we've come to an end of our series of talks. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on portraits. As I said, by all means, not trying to be exhaustive, but nonetheless trying to capture different iterations of what a portrait has been in the past, what it can do, and what it can say about us, but also about our plants and others.